Hey guys, welcome back to another video lesson. Today we are going to continue talking about the sine and cosine graphs. So on Thursday or Friday of last week, we talked about just what the graphs would look like without any transformation. So just what y equals sine of x or y equals sine of theta or y equals cosine of theta, what that would look like on your graph. And they were like these curves, that sine soars, cosine crashes, and it's just this continuous wave that keeps going and going and going. Then on Tuesday or Wednesday, you guys looked at the Desmos activity and you kind of saw how some different values, adding, subtracting, and multiplying, would affect the graph and see what happens. And today we're going to continue talking about those and kind of see how it looks like, what it looks like in your graph. So a couple things to note, we're going to be talking about the period. Once again, the period is like the cycle. It's once it starts repeating itself, okay? You look at it distance from peak to peak. Midline is just the line that goes through the halfway point of the graph. And then the amplitude is the distance from that midline to either the highest peak or the distance from the midline to the lowest valley. Okay, so there's a little image to help you out. These are the general equations. If you guys had your parent function toolkits, you guys remember A, H, and K that tell you different transformations. So your A value tells you your amplitude, your H value tells you a horizontal shift left and right, and then your K value tells you your midline. So this should make sense because the midline is dictated, like, is it moving up or is it moving down? The amplitude is like, how much is it stretched, right? Like, how much did it go? And then this B value is a new variable that we talk about, and that's just talking. You can determine the period just by taking 360 divided by your B value, which is your multiplier inside of the parentheses, okay? One thing to note is that this year we will not be talking about horizontal shifts. I just want to point out to you the reason why. If you take a look at this, so right now I've got this, get it back to zero-ish. Right now I've got this sine curve, right? And you know it's sine because sine soars, okay? But if I take this and I shift it over to the right, right? Well, now, if I actually look over here at the graph, it looks like cosine. Cosine crashes, right? So the reason that we are not talking about horizontal shifts left and right is because it can get a little bit confusing. And when you're looking at a sine graph, you can it can look like a cosine graph, depending on if it's shifted left or right. So moving forward, we're not going to talk about that H horizontal shift left and right. You guys will talk about that in pre-calc, though. So we're going to start by giving you the equation, giving you the graph, and we're going to determine some information about these things. So y is equal to 3 times the sine of 0.5x plus 2. So the first thing that you want to note is you can determine your period by figuring out what your b value is and then taking 360 divided by b. So my b value in this case is what I'm multiplying inside the parentheses. It's 0.5. So if I take 360 divided by 0.5, that gives me 720 degrees. So this curve starts repeating itself after 720 degrees. If I start by looking at this point right here, where I'm at 180 degrees, and then I look at this next peak, which is at 900, the distance between those two peaks, this right there, is would be 900 degrees minus 180, which is also 720 degrees. So that's how you see that related on the graph. You can find it using the equation, 360 divided by b, or you can find it by using the graph, just finding the distance between those two peaks. Then you have your midline. Your midline is y is equal to k. So looking at my graph, I can see right here, my k value is 2. So my midline is at y is equal to 2. On the graph, I can also see this because my highest point is at 5, like my highest y value is at 5. My lowest y value is at -1. So if I think about like the distance between 5 and -1, that's a total of 6 units, right? 6 units. And halfway between that would be 3 units. So if I start at 5 and go down 3 units, then my midline is right there. Okay, so that is my midline at y equals 2. It's halfway between that tallest point, that highest point, and the bottommost point, if you work your way in, okay? There it is. And then my amplitude, I determine by taking, that's just my A value. So in my equation, I can see that right here. My amplitude is 3. That's what I'm multiplying by out front. So that is 3. I can also see that by, if I look right here, the distance between my highest peak and my midline is 3 units. Or I can see between like my lowest valley and my midline, that is also 3 units. That's my amplitude. That's kind of like how much it's stretched out. All right, next. So taking a look at this one, you've got to find your period. To find the period, you just do 360 divided by your B value. My B value is 3. 360 divided by 3 is equal to 120 degrees, which should make sense looking at the graph. Oh, not a great line, but whatever, it's there. Okay, between 30 and 150, that is 120 degrees. So it takes 120 degrees for it to start repeating. Then I have my midline. This one's easiest to find from the equation. It's just your K value. So for my midline, I always need y is equal to -1. Or I could think, okay, kind of like my highest peak is at 3. My lowest valley is at -5. So between 3 and -5, there are 8 units in between, right? So halfway would be 4. So if I start at this 5 and I go up, at -5, and I go up 4 units right here, that would give me my midline, which is at -1. And then once again, my amplitude is just half of that, right? I talk about how there's 8 units between the highest peak and the lowest valley. Well, if there's 8 units in between there, halfway would be 4, right? I'm going from the midline, which is my halfway point, to the highest peak. That's 4 units. Oops, I should change my color. So I am going from my highest peak to my midline is 4 units, or my lowest valley to my midline is also 4 units, and I can see it right here in my equation as well. Okay, so both of these were 2 sine graphs, and I can kind of see that because starting from I'll highlight this. If I start from the the y-axis, here's my y-axis, sine soars. Same thing here. Here's my x-axis, sine soars. So notice that when there is a vertical shift, it's moving up or down, your sine is no longer starting at the origin, okay? That's like when there are no transformations, it starts at the origin. But when your whole graph shifts down 1, well, then you're starting at this -1, okay? So now cosine. Cosine crashes. So I'm starting up here and it's crashing. Okay, I got it. I've got my cosine. Now, starting with my period, same process here. I just do 360 divided by my B value. 360 divided by 2 is equal to, what is that, 150, 180. 180 degrees, which I can see easily here. Going between my first peak and my second peak is 180 degrees. Great. My midline, I can see right here is my K value. Y is equal to K. K is 3. So Y is equal to K, which is 3. And then I can sketch in, ooh, that's a bad line. My midline right there, halfway between the highest high and the lowest low. Same thing. And then my amplitude is 6. I can see that right here. It's my A value. And again, going from my midline to my highest high, 6 units, or my midline to my lowest low is also 6 units. All right. So you now know how to find these things on the graph and in the equation. So let's take a look if you're just given one or the other. All right. So looking at this, my period, once again, you find your period by just doing 360 divided by your B value, which is that 6. So 360 divided by 6 is equal to 60 degrees. Then I need to find my midline. Well, something to note here is there is no K value. So my midline is just at Y is equal to 0. And then I also need to find my amplitude. So my amplitude is given to me with this 2. It's just 2. Okay, so now I have to think about this. I have to think about where my highest value and my lowest value would be for my Y values. So I'm going to take a minute and just draw a rough sketch of this graph. So just hold on. Okay, so on here, you can see that I did just a very rough sketch. I didn't draw in the axes. I just drew in the midline, which is at Y = 0, and then my amplitude. So if I think about my midline being at 0 and my amplitude is 2, if I start at 0, I have to go up 2 from that. So my highest Y value would be shown over here, and that is just at 2. And then my lowest value, I'm starting at 0 and I'm going down 2 units. So my minimum Y value would be -2. Then so now let's take a look at another one. All right, so this one is cosine. For my cosine, period is found the same way. I am just taking 360 divided by my B value, which is 4, is equal to, then 360 divided by 4 is 90 degrees. So that's my period. That's when it's going to start repeating. My midline is given to me by my K value, so Y is equal to -2. My amplitude is just whatever I'm multiplying by out front, so that is my 3. So now I've got to just think about this a little bit. If my midline now is at -2, so my midline is at -2. If I start at -2 and go 3 above that, well, then my maximum Y value would be -2 plus 3, which is 1. And then my minimum, I'm starting at -2 and I go down 3. -2 minus 3 would be -5. Okay, so what I want you guys to do right now is write these problems down right now and try them out. See if you can do them on your own. Okay, so you can check your answers real quick, pause it again and check. But looking at this, a couple things to note, that if you are multiplying by a decimal inside of your parentheses, like 0.4, your period is now 900 degrees, so it kind of stretches it out. There were a couple of curveballs in problem number 7. First of all, if you are dividing by 1/3, that would be the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal or multiplying by 3, or you just need to be sure to put 1/3 in parentheses. You should get 1080 for your period for number 7. And then there was no amplitude written in number 7. So you'll recall in problem number 4, your midline was at Y = 0, because if there's nothing written in when you're adding or subtracting, that means plus 0. If there's nothing written in when you're multiplying, that's like, really, there's an imaginary 1 there, right? 1 times anything is itself. So that is why your amplitude in number 7 is 1. So then with the midline at 5, you just go up 1 or down 1 from 5. Next, we are going to write an equation given the transformation. So in this case, we are going to be given the period, right? So the period is equal to 360 divided by B. Do some cross multiplication here and solve. If you put, let's see, if I were to just put the P over 1, I would get 360 equals PB. and j, haha, just kidding. And I want to solve for b because that's what I'm going to use to write my equation. So divide by b, divide by p because I want to get b by itself. P. So my b value is actually equal to 360 divided by the period. So now we are going to go over a couple together and then you can try your own. All right. So my period is 60. So if I want to determine what my b value is, I would do 360 divided by 60, which is equal to 6, or rather tells me that b is equal to 6. Okay, my midline is my k value, my amplitude is 7. Thinking about what my maximum and minimum y value would be, I'm just doing the same thing as we did before. So if my midline is 7, 7 plus 5 is equal to, or I should put the 5 first, sorry. So you start with your midline. So your midline is 5. 5 plus 7 is equal to 12. And then for your minimum, you want to do 5 minus 7, which gives me -2. And then my equation, when I'm writing this equation, I've got to say y equals my amplitude is 7. So I'm going to write that in. 7 times the sine, because I'm told it's a sine curve. 7 times the sine of, in my parentheses, my b value is 6. So I'm going to say 6x. And then my midline tells me my k value. So I'm going to say plus 5. There is my equation. All right, let's do one more with cosine. So this is a cosine curve. So I am going to take 360 divided by 720, which is my p, and that will tell you what my b value is. So b is equal to 0.5. Then I've got to think, okay, to find my maximum y value, I take my midline, -9, plus my amplitude, which is equal to -5, and then my minimum y value, which is 9, minus my amplitude, which is -13. And then I can just fill all of these variables in to write my equation. So y is equal to, my amplitude is 4, that goes out front. 4 times, I'm told that I'm working with a cosine curve, so there it is. My period is 0.5, so that goes in for my b value, times x. And then my k value is that midline, so I am subtracting the 9. Okay, so I'll write on here some notes. Just remember, this tells you your b, right? The midline, that 9, tells you your k. The amplitude tells you your a, and that is all that you need to fill in. So what I want you guys to do right now is try writing out these next 2 equations by following the same process. Pause now. Okay, so go ahead and check your work right now. You should have gotten all of these values. Pause, check your work. All right, so one thing to note is on problem number 10, when you write the equation, I do not care if you write 1.5x or if you write 3/2 x. Either one is fine. That is all that I have for you today. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Let me know what's going on. If you just want to say hi, feel free. And have a great day, Nicolay.